If we don't mind, can we really quickly?
Live streaming is on.
If we don't mind, can we really quickly go over the paradigm?
Sorry, what was that, Rigby?
I didn't see your paradigm in the room. Would it be okay if you could, briefly, touch on that before we start the round?
Sorry, I couldn't hear you. What did you say? What did you want me to touch on?
The paradigm, if you have one.
I mean, basically for LD, my paradigm just comes down to: are you going to spread or not? If you're going to spread, just be careful that every word is enunciated still, even though you are spreading. Because if I can't understand what you're saying, even when spreading, well, then I can't give you the points for it. So, otherwise, I'm not a fan of the progressive kind of debate, but then if that's what you have prepared, well, then, that's perfectly fine. I'm not particularly picky when it comes to LD.
Okay, I don't have any other questions. Does my opponent?
I do, actually. I was wondering if a question is asked within the allotted time for cross and we run out of time before it's allowed to be answered, could we go a few seconds over just to kind of wrap that up?
Yeah, just finish whatever sentence or point you're making on the on whatever question was asked.
Cool. Awesome. I'm ready if everyone else is.
Okay, perfect. I'm ready as well. Awesome. So this is going to be the 6-minute affirmative constructive. Is anyone not ready? Read.
Sorry if I sound a little bit disoriented right now. I wasn't expecting to be put into an LD round last minute, but yeah, I'm ready.
You're good. Awesome. Sweet. And I will begin time shortly. I affirm resolved. A just government ought to recognize an unconditional right of workers to strike. The value is justice, defined as a distribution of wealth, opportunities, and privileges within a society. In order to create a society that is just, all people need to be morally included. The status quo fails. Governments draw conceptual lines between those who are in and out of their moral circle. Those who fall outside are morally excluded and become either invisible or demeaned so that governments don't have to acknowledge the injustice they suffer. Winter 99. Additionally, exclusion rationalizes structural inequality and social injustice at POW 01. We can only achieve justice when everyone is included. By changing these abusive systems, everyone can be recognized and then justice can be implemented. Thus, the criterion is mitigating structural oppression. The framework will always come first. Moral inclusion is a necessary precondition to all other ethical theories. Until everyone affected is included, we can't weigh the round. Contention 1, democracy. Democracies are vital because they allow for equal opportunities and rights. When the impacts are achieved, inclusion can happen, fulfilling the framework and combating oppression. There are 4 warrants. First, participation. McQueen and 15 writes that union members are 10% more likely to vote. The more parties involved in elections, the more just they become. Unconditional strikes allow for larger and fair elections. By establishing justice and democratic processes, democracy as a whole strengthens. Second is equity. Michelle in 21 explains that wages have disproportionately decreased for the lower class because of the erosion of collective bargaining. The income inequality makes democracy impossible. The American Political Science Association in 4. However, strikes solve. Unions on average raise wages by 16.4%, Spivak 19. By raising wages for people that need it the most, governments can up level playing fields, ultimately allowing democracy in society. Third is power dynamics. The top 1% owns 40% of the country's wealth, Ingram 17. Moreover, 36% of workers are employed by these big companies, Gutano 17. Strikes check power dynamics, leveling the playing fields for workers and creating equal opportunities. According to Chi in 20, democracies require participation on equal terms. Thus, strikes create the necessary environment for democracies and just governments. Fourth is basic rights. The United Nations explains that democracies require basic human rights. Thus, in order to achieve democracy, rights need to be protected, including striking. The NLRA recognizes the right to strike, proving its significance. Furthermore, conditions on the right to strike impede its inherent power and meaning. Pope 17, Ready 21. Judge, I want you to circle and star this card. It's really important. It's going to be a key reason why you're going to be voting affirmative. Contention 2 is social change. Curse systems are oppressing ideas, people, and communities. Strikes not only allow for changing these areas, creating justice and equity. In order to end oppression, not only systemic change is needed, but also social. There are 3 warrants. First, First, gender gap. Strikes are critical for women's rights. In the UK, striking was vital for women getting the right to vote. Additionally, the Equal Pay Act in the United States was a result of striking. Howard 21. The power of strikes can implement feminism and gender equality in the status quo. By combating wage gaps and lack of intrinsic rights, strikes initiate systemic change and decrease oppression. Second is race. Black workers face higher unemployment rates, fewer job opportunities, lower pay, poor benefits, and greater job instability. Wheeler 19. However, strikes provide solvency and help change oppressive systems. Unions have been successful in the past, but they need a stronger ability to strike in order to reduce the racial wealth inequalities. This requires government action. Perry 21. The government action that Perry talks about is unconditional strikes. Voting Act solves a problem like these and sets a more just standard. Third is climate change. Strikes around the world have drawn attention to the climate crisis. Fisher 20. Voting Act allows for recognition of rights and important issues, including global warming. When strikes are limited, ideas like this get ignored and change cannot happen. Unconditional strikes allow for social change to be maximized and prioritized. Judge, that's a really important warrant. By changing social views, inclusion can happen, and the power of the people can be used to directly change injustice systematically. Contention 3 is protection. Oppression and structural violence can't be solved without security. And unconditional strikes allow for protection in 4 ways, ultimately creating an environment for justice and equity. The first is legislation. Unions provide beneficial legislation to be passed and maintained. In the United States, unions have provided Social Security, anti-discrimination regulations, health and safety regulations, and the federal minimum wage. Bevins in 17. Without these protection services, oppression would increase, and the laws that directly help minorities wouldn't exist. The second is income. Extend the 5x19 card that says when wages are increased by 16.4% with unions. Additionally, Reinhart and 20 explains the exact same warrant and impact. In the status quo, money buys rights, freedoms, and protection. It costs money to be safe. That's Cook in 17. By raising wages, people can better protect themselves and their rights. Third is work standards. TUC in 16 writes that unions cut down work injuries by 50%. In addition, Cole 19 explains that unions were able to take children out of factories, workers out of radioactive environments. Unions have saved thousands and thousands of lives. The impact makes the workplace more inclusive and creates systemic change that is needed for justice and a just government. Fourth is non-domination. Strikes are ways of resisting structural domination. Gorvich 16. Strikes allow for employees to balance the power of their employers and exercise the ability to make change. By 19. When the right to unconditional strike is protected and upheld, employees can provide much needed justice for their employers, because the only way to protest this and give justice is to protect strikes and make them unconditional. By protecting all members of society, the framework is achieved. We can't end oppression without safety and protection towards all members of the public. I am so proud to affirm. And I'm ready for cross-examination when my opponent is.
Okay, I'm going to take 20 seconds of prep before cross. I'll start my time for that now. Okay, that was 20 seconds, meaning that I have 3 minutes and 40 seconds left. Is anyone not ready for cross? Okay, cool. Then I will begin my time when I say my first word. Let me get to my little page here. Okay. Starting now. So the first thing that I would like to ask about is in reference to something that you made, a comment that you made in your contention 2. It was on your first warrant, I think. You mentioned that strikes have been used for gender equity, and you mentioned women's suffrage movement, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. I just wanted to double check that. And then I also missed your contention 3, warrant 4. It was non-domination. Can you explain that really quick?
Yeah, so we can look in Ba 19 and Gorvich in 16. Strikes are ways of resisting structural domination, and they can protest employers and exercise the ability to make change. And the only way to continue this activism and make sure that it's not abused and limited and creating a really bad loophole is to make strikes unconditional.
Why would making them unconditional specifically end this harmful system?
Yeah, so when strikes are limited, more specifically, when strikes are conditional, that means that the employer has the control, right? So they can tell these employees they can't go on strike. That creates a loophole and change can't happen. We can see really
Okay.
big impacts like social change is limited, democracy is limited, and like the freedom
Yeah,
of
I got it.
free protest.
So I want to make sure that we're on the same page in terms of what unconditional means. What are some of examples of conditions on striking that would be eliminated in the affirmative?
Conditions on striking, all conditions.
Yeah, like some examples.
I don't really know how that's like necessary, like the burden of affirmative, but like all conditions. Like essentially there's like no limits on what the
All
employee.
conditions. Okay, yeah, that's what I
Yeah,
want.
because that's what the affirmative advocacy is, just no conditions or
All right,
unconditional
got
strikes.
it. Then you also mentioned in your contention 3, point 1 on legislation, you mentioned some like effective union strikes. So let me just be correct here. These are in the status quo, right?
That's not my argument. And I want to make this really clear for you and the judge. So this argument is essentially saying legislation has been passed before with strikes, right? But because strikes are conditional, that allows for like a scale of conditions. So
Okay, I have a follow-up question. Do you
this is-
have any statistics showing the difference in efficacy of?
Wait, can I actually finish that answer? Because
I understood. Okay, sure.
okay, so essentially what the argument is, we can only like maintain and continue helpful legislation when we're not limiting strikes and we're using the affirmative advocacy. And you
Okay.
can ask the second question.
I got it. Okay. So the second question was a follow-up to that was, do you have any statistics or cards to show the specific difference between conditional and unconditional strikes in terms of efficacy? Like, do you have any specific evidence showing that unconditional is like much more effective at gaining all these social benefits?
Exactly. I actually have 2 pieces of evidence that do a really good job with this. The first is Pope in 17, and the second is Ready.
No, I know you have cards from experts saying that it will happen, but I'm wondering if you have any
that's what
specific
it
evidence showing like how much, what, by what metric, by what, like any statistics.
I think that's a really bad question because it's not applicable in the status quo. Unconditional strikes haven't existed in history like ever, right? So there's no way to like more specifically like to get an exact percentage because it's never happened before and it's like not applicable in today's round.
Okay. Well, that's time. I'm going to take running prep before my next speech. I'll start my time for that now. All right, that was 2 minutes of prep, meaning that I have 1 minute and 40 seconds left. I will now move on to my negative construction and first negative rebuttal. I'll do them in that order. I have 7 minutes, and is anyone not ready? All right, then I will begin my time when I say my first word. Resolved. A just government ought to recognize workers' unconditional right to strike. For the sake of clarity, I will provide the following definitions. A just government, whatever action a government ought to take so as to become just. Ought, an auxiliary verb used to express duty or moral obligation. Recognize, to formally acknowledge. Unconditional right, a fundamental right without applicable conditions. Strike, an attack that is intended to seize or inflict damage on or destroy an objective. Additional definitions can be provided upon request, and I stand in firm affirmation of the resolution. My value is morality, and my value criterion is minimizing structural violence. Contention 1. Unconditional strikes provide additional power to oppressive systems. In the status quo, corporations and workers are both subject to striking conditions. For example, in some cases by the National Labor Relations Act, if a worker on strike is temporarily replaced while on that striker is placed on a preferential hiring list and must be offered a job when an opening next occurs. Were strikes to be guaranteed unconditionally, these workers would have no guarantee that they could go back to work, thus actually stripping power away from the worker. Rita 18 expands upon the marginalization of low-wage workers. On average, across the United States, a minimum wage worker must work between 61 to 78 hours a week to afford a one-bedroom apartment. Taking in the cost of raising a family, food, transportation, and other living expenses into perspective, the NLIHC map indicates that these adult minimum wage workers are not making enough money to live anywhere in the United States. The Economic Policy Institute also finds that workers of color are far more likely to be paid poverty-level wages than white workers. In other words, low-wage workers are clearly some of the most marginalized citizens in the United States, and an unconditional right to strike actually decreases their collective bargaining power. To minimize the oppression of these workers and the structural violence that they face, we need to recognize their rights to strike on a conditional basis. Contention 2, the unconditional right to strike harms the poor and marginalized. Subpoint A, healthcare strikes disproportionately harm those that are too poor to afford private healthcare in other nations. In Nigeria, doctor strikes have left millions of poor patients just without care. One patient was supposed to be having treatment for colon cancer, but according to him, since the strike started, no doctor has come to check on me. This patient, who was supposed to be starting a second round of chemotherapy at the state-run National Hospital, says he has received no treatment since August. One of the conditions of healthcare worker strikes is that hospitals must be given enough notice to hire temporary replacements. In the AF world, where strikes are guaranteed unconditionally, and as my opponent agreed in cross, that means absolutely no conditions, an unannounced healthcare worker strike could lead to thousands of deaths. Not just thousands of deaths, but specifically the deaths of those that are too poor to leave the country for private care. In other words, to participate in medical tourism. And this isn't just a problem in the developing world. In New York City, doctor strikes increase mortality rates by up to 20%. Subpoint B, law enforcement strikes disproportionately harm people of color. In many states, law enforcement officers are not allowed to strike. For example, according to Texas Government Code on Fire and Police Employee Relations, the health, safety, and welfare of the public demands that strikes, lockouts, and work stoppages and slowdowns of firefighters and police officers be prohibited. Not only would a massive firefighter strike be a huge threat to public safety, but let's envision a law enforcement strike in the AF world, which would again be unconditional. Then again, 20, the Kentucky Police Union rallied around officers who had fatally shot EMT worker Breonna Taylor in her home. He continues, very few of the officers involved in such crimes face serious, if any, consequences, and much of that impunity is owed to the power of police unions. A recent Harvard study finds that Black Americans are 3.23 times more likely than white Americans to be killed by police. In other words, unconditional rights to strike for police officers in the AF world means truly unconditional power. Police unions would have more power than ever before to protect murderers and resist reforms for racial equity if strikes were to be guaranteed unconditionally. Minimizing the structural violence that marginalized people face means a vote for morality and a vote for the neg. On to my opponent's case. So for framework, I see no point in really going over that. Justice is synonymous to morality. At this point, we're debating whose case better upholds a shared framework. One thing I would like to say about that, though, is that, again, my opponent agreed that unconditional means all conditions. That could include violence. You know, like unconditional is dangerous. I'm not saying that some conditions aren't oppressive, but unconditional takes measures too far. In his first contention, he mentions democracy and that it depends on participation and that union members are 10% more likely to vote. Which, I mean, maybe, but they're more likely to vote for conservative campaigns, as you can cross-apply my police cards. And I have another card to show that unions often vote for, I guess, problematic policies. Avendaño 19, the labor movement has been a bystander or even complicit, especially in male-dominated industries where harassment is most pervasive. In handling grievances, unions frequently sided with union men who were accused of harassment. Unions stood on the sidelines when women unionists brought legal claims that would set the boundaries of acceptable behavior in the workplace. And union leaders and members created and fed a hyper-masculine culture in the union hall and on the shop floor where harassment was accepted and too often condoned. Combine this with my cards on police unions, and you can see why increased union power harms both women and people of color and is something that would indefinitely exist in the affirmative world. So that point would fall. He also mentions his points 2 and 3 are on equity and power dynamics. However, strikes have caused no significant change, which is a card by Bavard 21. And you can cross-apply this to his contention 2.1 with the gender gap. He brings up the women's suffrage movement. Yeah, women can vote, but the gender gap still exists in the workplace 100 years later. Strikes have failed to be a correct and long-lasting rebellion against capitalism. All of these problems still exist and have not been affected by strikes in the past. In his contention 1, subpoint 4, he mentions that strikes are a basic human right. However, my point is not that workers shouldn't be allowed to strike. It's that the unconditional right to strike goes too far and endangers other citizens. You can cross-apply my entire second contention. In response to his contention 2, subpoint 2 on race, you can just cross-apply the point that I had with police unions actually disproportionately harming Black Americans. And as far as the climate crisis goes, you can apply my union cards, meaning that just because climate crisis wouldn't be solved by strikes. If anything, unions being more likely to vote would mean that such climate crisis or progressive policies in terms of harassment would actually not be voted for. So we don't see this impact coming through. And in terms of his third contention on protection, his first argument in terms of legislation is non-unique. This exists in the status quo. His second point that wages are increased, this is actually fundamentally untrue. Strikes don't actually help workers. On the national level, they're bad for the economy and they push businesses to close their doors. Hostess is an example. And they're not good for the economy and they're not good for workers. And that's why his third point would also fall, because working standards, again, no significant change. I urge a vote in the negative. And I now stand ready for cross-examination.
Awesome. Let me just get that pulled up. 1 second. Okay. Is my judge ready? Judge, are you ready? Yeah. Judge, are you ready for cross-examination? Let's see.
Well,
Can my opponent hear me?
I can, yeah.
Okay, then maybe Judge.
I guess we can just wait a minute, but
Yeah. Okay, I think he, well. No, we can't hear you, but we can start if you're still ready. Okay, awesome. And is my opponent still ready?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. And then I'll begin again on my first word. Okay. So let's start with some groundwork. Are strikes conditional in the status quo?
Well, I mean, yes, pretty much. I mean, it depends specifically, but by and large, yes.
Okay,
Although
so
in some situations, there aren't applicable conditions.
like about the harms they talk about in your case, is there any solvency if conditions are the status quo?
Well, the neg doesn't have the burden of solvency in LD.
But it still doesn't have any?
But that's irrelevant. The neg does not have the burden of solvency.
But just because it's not a burden doesn't mean you can't provide it. So the status quo, you're advocating for the status quo, correct?
I'm not advocating for the status quo. I'm saying that the affirmative is worse.
Okay, but opposite of the affirmative is the status quo.
Yeah, but I'm not saying that the status quo is good. I'm saying that the affirmative is worse than the status quo and the neg does not have the burden of solvency.
The status quo is opposite of the affirmative.
Yeah, but just because one thing is bad doesn't inherently mean that the other is good.
Okay, well, it's either unconditional or conditional. So wouldn't like inherently you be like debating conditional strikes?
I am saying that conditional strikes, the negative world is better than the affirmative. Not necessarily that that is the end all be all most just policy.
And then the negative world is conditions. Awesome.
Not in every situation. In some specific situations, strikes are guaranteed unconditionally based on the contract policies of that company.
That's sufficient. What's your value?
My value is morality.
Morality. Awesome.
Yep.
And then how is that determined?
You mean like what's the value criterion? Minimizing structural violence. You
Okay.
achieve the value by ensuring the value criterion.
Okay. So like inherently, like if you're advocating for like the status quo, how are you like creating change for structural violence?
The neg doesn't have the burden of solvency. I'm saying that the affirmative makes structural violence worse. And to minimize structural violence is a vote for the negative.
Isn't like whatever can do it better, it's just whoever does it worse. Like your framework is just like your framework isn't a goal, it's like a place not to go.
Wait, can you rephrase your question?
So like your framework is a place to go, like never mind. We can just move on. So let's talk about your first contention. It's about like replacement workers, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So like, why is that? Why can we not have replacement workers with unconditional strikes?
Because that is a condition of the strike.
So like we can't have replacement workers for other factors. Like strikes are the only like way we can have replacement workers.
What do you mean?
So like we can't replace workers in any other scenario.
I mean, like if someone were to die and their job, like if they were to quit, someone else could replace their job. But whether or not companies are allowed to rehire temporary workers or whether or not they have to offer back positions, that is a condition of the strike.
Really quickly move on. So are like federal workers, like our military members, federal workers?
Military members, yeah, they are federal workers.
Okay, just want to make that clear.
Yeah.
I'm gonna start some prep now. Okay, I'll stop prep there. That's about, I'd say like a minute 50 used. That works with everyone. Okay, and then the order for this speech, it's just gonna go straight down the affirmative flow and then the negative flow. That works with everyone. Okay. Is anyone not ready? We good? Awesome. Just again, affirmative flow, then negative flow. Okay, it's gonna be 4 minutes. And if we're all still good, I'm gonna start time at my first word. Okay, so starting off with the affirmative flow with like the value of justice, essentially there's no response. We can go back to like my entire like framework. They're not like specifically attacking the awards and what I'm talking about, like moral inclusion, right? Moral inclusion, and more specifically Padua 1 and Winter 99 talk about how this is going to have to come first, especially in today's round, right? Moral like disinclusion, right, justifies like these really bad impacts and like social injustice and etc., right? So like in order to like create justice and even like morality that my opponent's advocating for, right? In order to do that, we need to like create inclusion first, judge. The framework will always come first. And then like they talk about like violence kind of out of the like blue, but that's not justified. Like I just want to make that really clear in case my opponent tries like to extend this argument. Violence isn't justified. Just because people have the unconditional right to strike doesn't mean like the freedom of consequence completely goes away, right? Consequences are still applicable in each world. Now let's talk about Convention 1 democracy. I read 4 warrants and my opponent like partially attacked all of them. When I talk about like participation, they say that like these like unions are going to vote for conservative. I have 3 answers. Why is that bad? It's still more turnout. The elections are still more just. Conservative like views aren't necessarily like automatically bad. That's really barred. Second, there's no card that they read in their case that like says or like present in today's run that specifically says like democracies and like when you increase voter turnout, they're going to like automatically vote conservative. And then second, they're not like actually attacking the warrant. The warrant is in order to like continue the trend of like more people voting, we need to like make unions and strikes unconditional. That's the actual warrant, judge. This like their attacks completely fall. Now let's talk about equity and power dynamics. They're saying we're not seeing any change right now. That's the complete argument, judge. We're not seeing like really big changes in equity and power dynamics because of these conditions. My own opponent says the exact same thing, judge. We're not increasing equity and aren't like leveling the playing fields to like the scale that we need to because strikes are conditional. My own opponent advocates for that, judge. We need to be making strikes unconditional if we want to be like increasing equity and like leveling the power dynamics, judge. My own opponent admits that. Now let's talk about like basic rights, my 4th warrant. I talk about how strikes are really important and like democracies and just governments recognize these rights, right? But they say we go too far. There's no such thing as like having too much of a right. Like specifically like in democracies, the more rights, the better, right? That's extremely important. And like if we want to be giving people equal opportunities, rights are just going to have like on net balance a positive influence in the world. Now let's talk about Convention 2 social change. Again, they like try to classify the argument that we're not having any changes in gender gap. That's not true. We've seen change, but also again, that's the argument. Classify the argument. We're not seeing change because of the conditions. They talk about like race. They talk about like police officers, and it's actually like bad for like Black police officers. Police officers are like 1% of society, judge. We're not like actually looking at the entire scope of race. On balance, we're still seeing a bigger impact for race, and we're still solving racism a lot better and racial discrimination a lot better when you vote for affirmative. On climate change, they said we're not solving climate change. That's not the argument, judge. The argument is that ideas like climate change get ignored when strikes are limited, judge. If we want to like perpetuate like really important like ideas and like social change, we need to be making strikes unconditional because Fisher and 20 explains that exact same warrant because conditions impede its inherent like power and like meaning. On Convention 3 on legislation, they say we're not seeing that, and like we're seeing it in the status quo. That's not the argument, judge. If we want to continue legislation, we need to make strikes unconditional. I tried to mention that in cross-examination. My opponent wouldn't let me. And then on income, they said that's not true. Where's the warrant? We can literally look back to my entire case where we see actual cards that say like wages are increased, and we like see income going up, which actually creates like protection, judge. That's really important. And then extend the rest of my case. And then on their case, morality, we're going to see that my framework will always come first. Inclusion is a necessary precondition. On replacement workers, there's no solvency. You can't replace workers. You can replace workers with unconditional strikes. You don't have to just replace workers just with strikes. And then also you can't replace workers when the economy is bad, judge. Like the economy and like production isn't going to increase. Like democracy isn't going to increase when you vote for negative, so this can't happen. And then poor things like there's no solvency. They don't fix these issues. And second, the warrant isn't actually true. And then also we're ignoring rights. That's really important. And then finally, the impacts don't happen. We're not actually seeing this when they say like federal workers and like essential workers. Like that's not actually happening. Like the logic has failed. I'm so proud to affirm.
All right, I'm going to take the rest of my prep before my next speech. I'll start my time for that now. Oh, I was muted, sorry. That is my time. I have 6 minutes for this final speech. Brief off-time roadmap. I'll be going over and defending I'm going to do the affirmative case first, and then I'll talk about the negative. Is anyone not ready? Okay, then I will start when I say my first word. Okay, so in terms of framework debate, my opponent brings up that like morality has to come first. I'm just going to reiterate what I said before, or justice comes first, but there is no point in debating the difference between justice and morality. Like we're still talking about justice for all people. He argues that as if because I don't have the words all people, that morality only applies to the like few and far between. But that's, like justice and morality still would both apply on a universal standard. There's no point in debating like the nitpicky things between two essentially synonyms. It's just whose case better upholds like a shared framework. And then he also mentions, in response to my violence point, he argues that consequences still exist. However, the consequences of a strike are the conditions of a strike. Like the conditions, if a strike, like if workers are allowed to strike unconditionally, meaning, like they may or may not, whether or not they have like a guaranteed job when they get back after their strike, like that is an example of a condition. Conditions like that don't exist in the affirmative world. And violence is one of those conditions. Things, like in a contract, when workers are allowed to strike, it stipulates, like strikes cannot be violent. That literally is a condition of a strike. So we fail, and he also has no card of that. He's just saying that consequences aren't like that are separate from the conditions. And he also mentions that it's not necessarily bad that there are like more people voting. And I'm not saying that it's bad. I'm just saying that like conservatives in like when we look at police unions, which tend to like police officers tend to vote for conservative things. That means they are voting against reforms for racial equity, and they are voting against policies that like advance climate change, which he emphasizes the importance of like climate change awareness in his own case. And you can also in terms of like sexism awareness, that's also something that those unions would tend to vote against. So you can just outweigh that. And then he also argues that there's no such thing as too much of a right. However, even fundamental rights have limits. They have conditions. Like the right to freedom of speech has its limits. You can't, like, once freedom of speech becomes hate speech, it's not freedom of speech anymore. That literally is a condition of fundamental rights. He tries to make it seem like unconditional right to strike is the same thing as a fundamental basic human right. It's not. It actually means there is less safety, and that the vast majority of people are fundamentally unsafe because of a lack of conditions. He also argues that he is solving discrimination more so in the AF world. Need I remind you that the neg does not have the burden of solvency. This is not my job to solve all of these problems, only to prove that he does not. And he also, furthermore, has no example. He argues that like ideas of climate change are ignored without strikes. However, he provides no example of a strike that brings awareness to climate change that I got. Then he also argued, where's the warrant in terms of my argument that strikes don't bring about significant changes. However, you can cross-apply the Bavard 19 card that I argued that strikes, one, don't provide specific significant change. And I can explain why. Strikes don't actually help workers. Let's look to the grand motor strikes. The reality, according to Richard 20, a strike hurts the workers the most, not the company, not the business, the actual worker, the same workers my opponent claims to be helping. And the Journal of Labor Economics finds that strikes become even less successful when guaranteed unconditionally because it is the conditions that make the strike powerful. This goes back to my entire first contention that like conditions of a strike apply to both the worker and the like employer. One condition to strike is that employers must guarantee that strikers can come back afterwards in some cases. That goes away in the affirmative world. In the affirmative world, workers that go on strike have even fewer protections that they have in the status quo, thus making oppression worse. He also completely drops my second contention subpoint A about healthcare workers. At this point, you can just outweigh it, Judge. Like we in the AF world, we're looking at thousands of deaths, maybe even millions, because of healthcare worker strikes. Healthcare strikes disproportionately harm those that are too poor to afford private care in other nations. If we want to talk about minimizing structural violence, we need to talk about poor people who can't afford healthcare in the affirmative world. What they just have to go without doctors. And I would believe that that is fundamentally unjust or immoral, whatever you want to call it. And also, my opponent continues to argue that strikes are like a really positive opportunity for change, and moreover, like the workers' best way to advocate for change. And like he brings up all of these changes that strikes would bring about. However, according to the Washington Post, a record 4.3 million people quit their jobs in August alone. Labor Department data shows so many businesses need employees, economists say, that working people have more leverage than they've had in many years in the status quo. So we don't need the unconditional right to strike. Again, cross-apply my first contention. Strikes, conditions are what make strikes powerful. I'm just going to reiterate my case and move on to voters at this point, given that he dropped pretty much my entire second contention. Or the first subpoint A. At this point, given that we have a very similar framework, it comes down to who is mitigating the most structural violence, like who is reducing, not necessarily reducing, but keeping oppression from getting worse or reducing it. And that would have to go to the negative. In the affirmative world, oppression gets worse. Workers have even less protection conditions than they have in the status quo. Again, the neg does not have the burden of solvency. And there are, Black workers, women of color, women workers, just in general, have fewer rights because of fewer conditions. Some conditions may be oppressive. However, those conditions can be removed without having the whole strikes as a whole be guaranteed unconditionally. It is the whole complete unconditional measure that makes the unconditional right to strike fundamentally dangerous. It means that people are going without health care, that strikes could easily become violent or destroy valuable property for the company or for the workers themselves. Like I said, you can cross-apply the card that I just read, that strikes actually hurt the worker if failed. I urge a vote in the negative.
Awesome. I'm not going to be using any prep. I'm all ready. So is my opponent ready? Yep. And there's my judge. Are you still good? And we're having some technical difficulties. We're good. Okay. So the order of this speech, I'm just going to do some crystallization and fixing and clarifying some things in today's round, like the main sources of clash. And then I'm going to get into framework, and there's going to be 3 voters and reasons why affirmative is paramount. Okay, are we all still good? Yeah. Opponent, are you ready? Okay. Awesome. So the first misconception is that strikes hurt workers, and my opponent talks about this a lot. But on a net balance, that's not true, because striking increases democracy, increases protection, and social change. This will always come first. My opponent might list this 1% example, but on a net balance, which is what we're debating in today's round, striking is way more beneficial, and we're actually going to see solvency and systemic change when we make strikes unconditional. And then second, when they say negative doesn't have the burden of solvency, that's okay. Judge, just because my opponent says that they don't have the burden of solvency, that means that nothing changes because they're not solving any issues. Oppression doesn't change. Burden or not, exclusion, poverty, violence, all these really big issues in the status quo, no change. We're not seeing any increases. So judge, if you want to be voting on impacts or impact calculus in today's round, you're going to be dropping them right now, more specifically, because they're not actually creating any change because there's no solvency. They admit that themselves. And then second, we're also seeing that they also unconditional strikes are so important. That goes completely dropped. And I'm going to see exactly reiterate from what I read in my constructive. Pope in 17 and Reddy in 21. Again, strikes are really important because they can create democracy, social change, and protection. But these are completely limited, and the power and meaning goes away when you vote for negative because conditions are placed on them, restricting and limiting the ability for people to express themselves and their voices. And then second, when they said they're not advocating for unconditional strikes, that's okay. That means that they're advocating for the opposite. If they're not advocating for unconditional strikes, that means they're advocating for everything else, which is conditions. That's in the inherent definition of striking, and more specifically unconditional versus conditional. So they need to prove why all conditions is bad, and clearly they failed in that. So now let's get on framework. On the value of justice and morality, they said that they're the same. I mean, it's okay. It doesn't matter, judge, if you use justice, morality. You're still going to see that you're not achieving that in the status quo or in their case, but the only way to achieve that and to create systemic change is through affirmative, judge. Right now, oppression is happening. Disinclusion is happening. We read that in my own framework, right? Moral inclusion is so necessary, right? And my opponent doesn't solve for that. Moral inclusion will always come first. My opponent doesn't solve, they admit that themselves. Again, going in framework, that idea itself is completely dropped. Moral inclusion is a prerequisite. Until everyone that's affected is included, we can't wait around, Judge. You're going to be using the framework. But on that framework, let's get into the 3 main reasons why you're going to want to vote affirmative and why affirmative is so important when it comes to rights and justice and morality. The first is democracy, right? Democracy is so important and it allows for people to express themselves, their ideas on equal terms. Sheehan 20 explains that exact same evidence in card, right? So we see this isn't achieved when you vote for negative because you're taking away people's opportunity to express themselves. Democracy doesn't happen. There's really bad impacts power dynamics completely goes against itself. Now let's talk about systemic change. Again, oppression is happening right now. We can look to both of our cases. People are dying. Violence is happening. We see segregation, racism, gender inequality, all this stuff we both talk about. However, this is a key difference from AF and NAG. NAG doesn't solve. They make them themselves. It doesn't matter if they have the burden of or not. We're not fixing actual issues when you vote for negative. The only way to create moral inclusion, to change these really abusive systems, is to increase rights. And we see these exact links in my case, because when you increase rights, you create democracy, social change, and protection. That's really important. And now more specifically, let's get into the third and final reason why you're going to be voting affirmative in today's round. Protection. Again, my third and fourth warrant of work standards and power dynamics are completely dropped, Judge. There's not a single reason why you shouldn't be voting on them because there's not a single reason why it's not fully correct. Judge, until everyone is safe, we can't create justice and morality. The only way to achieve a just government, a government that my opponent outlines in their own case, that's creating morality and justice, right? All these really important issues. The only way to do that is protect people and maintain the right to life. It's because unconditional strikes allow for democracy, systematic change, protection, and moral inclusion that I'm so proud to affirm. Thank you. Good round. That was really fun.
Yeah, really good job.
Does our judge, do you need anything else from us? How are you going to disclose? Whatever works for you.
None of my judges have been disclosing, but I don't know if they're allowed to or not. I have no idea.
That's fine. I'm good with whatever. So.
Oh, he's good. I don't know if you can hear me, but good work, folks. I guess since his mic isn't working, it'd be just better to receive feedback in ballots, probably.
Yeah, probably.
Okay, well, really good round. Have a good night, everybody.
Thank you. Good job today. Thank you guys for judging again. Awesome.